Allow me to add my good morning to those that have already been extended. And as we have shared together in the Thanksgiving season, Nelson and I were kidding with one another here a couple of weeks ago in terms of his sermon last Sunday and my message today. And he wanted to know why I was going to preach on Thanksgiving again. Did I think he wouldn't get it right? And I assured him that he would get it right, but I had a little more on the subject that I wanted to say this morning, and particularly in the context of Psalm 100, which we have just shared together with one another. I must share with you that as I reach back across the decades to my earliest religious training and earliest experiences with Scripture, I recall in Wymena Park Elementary School in Ocala, Florida, in about the fourth grade, the teacher there gave us instructions that we were all going as we moved towards Thanksgiving to memorize a passage of Scripture. And so dutifully and sometimes painfully we did so. That passage of Scripture was Psalm 100. And down across the decades, it has continued to mean a great deal to me as I think in terms of God's blessings and God's grace, God's mercy and God's presence in my life that cared for me and sustained me through many difficult times during childhood and in young adulthood, and certainly across these 5 decades of ministry that have unfolded that Peggy and I have shared together with one another. When we come to occasions like this, we think about and we talk about giving thanks. And often in those occasions, when we're together in smaller groups and we're given the opportunity to express our gratitude and what we're thankful to God for, we have tendency sometimes to focus upon those tangible sort of things. We thank God for our spouses and our children, for our family relationships, for the work that we share together. We thank God for the house in which we dwell, for the food that graces our tables, for the fellowship and relationships that we share together with others, and for the time that we spend together in worship and in fellowship and doing God's will and God's purpose in our lives. That's important. That's useful. That is, in fact, something that we should do. And yet, when I come to the book of Psalms and I look at that collection of literature from the story and from the history of ancient Israel, I discover that there are lots of different kinds of psalms in that psalter. Some of them are dirges and funeral songs. Some of them are laments, grieving over the difficulties and the stresses of the nation or of an individual. Sometimes they are designed to be participated in public worship, and so they are antiphonal in a way that the priest could quote one line of the psalm and the congregation could respond in another. There are many different types of psalms, but Psalm 100 in particular is a psalm of thanksgiving. And so I want to focus there this morning and to approach this a little bit differently than you might be expecting. For as surely as there are these tangible material things for which we should appropriately be grateful, I think it's true that in our lives that we don't spend enough time being grateful to God and expressing our gratitude to God for those non-tangible, intrinsic kinds of things that are so very important for us and make our life meaningful in relationship to God and in relationship to one another, and particularly in the country in which we live. And so what I'd like to do is to just walk you through 4 different Thanksgiving observations across recent centuries and focus not just upon the historical events that took place, but the kinds of principles, the kinds of ideas, the kinds of images that those 4 Thanksgivings lay down for us that we need to reaffirm our commitment to, our belief in, our gratitude to God for, not just with our words, but in the way that we practice those principles in our day-to-day living. The first one that I would mention certainly goes back to that original Thanksgiving that we celebrate, that the children in the preschool celebrated here several days ago as they had their Thanksgiving feast and ate corn and chicken nuggets. But they had a good time, and they were reminded of this important event in American history. The truth of the matter is that in the year 1607, a group of Christian believers, of separatists from the Church of England, related to a congregation in England that was called the Scrooby Manor church, decided that if they were going to be able to continue to practice their religion, their understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ and their way of worship, that some changes were going to have to be made in their circumstances. First of all, many of them fled from England to Holland to get away from the persecution. The years passed there, and they began to be concerned that their children and their grandchildren were going to lose their ethnic and social identity as Englishmen. And so many of them returned to England, finding, however, that the struggle was still great. And so a small group of these people, under the leadership of their pastor at the time, a man by the name of John Robinson, decided that they would embark from England, and that they would travel across the stormy Atlantic Ocean, and that they would found a colony in the New World where they could practice their understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ with all of the freedom and all of the liberty that they thought was so absolutely essential. And so that group of believers gathered on the wharf at Plymouth. Pastor Robinson preached for them one last sermon. He planned to go with a second group that was going to immigrate as well, but health circumstances kept him from being able to do so. And so under the leadership of William Bradford and others, that intrepid group of Christian believers crossed the Atlantic Ocean, did not get where they originally intended to get because they thought they were on the way to Virginia. Rather, they landed off the coast of Cape Cod in Massachusetts and founded a colony there named after the town that they had just departed from. They called it Plymouth. And there they founded that first Christian settlement in the New World. Now, why is this important for us? Well, it's important because in their leaving England and their traveling across the Atlantic Ocean, in their conversations, one of their questions was, how are we going to manage ourselves? How are we going to govern ourselves? What kind of society and what kind of culture are we going to create that will both establish and maintain the existence of these principles that we think are so very, very important? And so on November the 11th, 1620, there in the harbor created by Cape Cod, before they ever landed, they gathered together and they wrote a document. That document has been handed down to us across the intervening generations as the Mayflower Compact. It is important for us because it is the first time in all of human history that a group of free people set down in writing their need for and commitment to a society where people practiced participatory self-government. Not ruled by a king, not ruled by a dictator, not ruled by some kind of powerful oligarchy, but rather the governing of themselves from the ground up. Making their own choices, making their own decisions, choosing their own leaders, and under the leadership of God, living out their lives of faith. These people that we call pilgrims laid down for us one of God's richest and most important gifts in our lives, and that is the truth of religious freedom and of participatory self-government. Here, in this Thanksgiving season 2018, I would remind you as a congregation and anyone who may be listening as we live stream this worship service this morning, that we need to never forget how important the principle of religious liberty and the principle of participatory self-government is. It has been purchased in the blood of generations who have said, yes, that is God's will, that is God's purpose, that is God's intention for the people whom God created in God's image and God's likeness to have fellowship with their Creator. The first Thanksgiving. The decades passed. Stresses developed in a variety of different ways. And those settlers there in Plymouth, now a part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and other colonies up and down the eastern seaboard would increasingly struggle with how they related to the nation of England in terms of trade and of government and a variety of different things. And you know the story of how ultimately that would lead to what we have come to call the American Revolution and the founding of this nation. We celebrate July the 4th, 1776, and the signing of the Declaration of Independence and all of the things that were associated with that, including a very, very long war. In our preoccupation with that, we have a tendency to forget that not long after the war was over and the liberty had been won, people found themselves scratching their heads and wondering, how in the world is this going to work? How are we going to unite all of these disparate people from all of these colonies into one government where everyone assists and supports and cares for and respects the dignity and the freedom of everyone else up and down the seaboard? They tried a thing called the Articles of Confederation. It was a miserable failure. And so a few years later, a group of them gathered in the city of Philadelphia, and they worked all summer long in one of the hottest, most difficult summers that part of the country had ever experienced. And the end result was the forming of a document called the Constitution that begins with the words, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare of ourselves and of others, do establish this Constitution of the United States of America." A written document, but a document that had to be put in place. And so over a period of months, up and down the seaboard to all of the colonies, state legislatures, state governments worked together on the ratification of that Constitution and bringing it into law. Ultimately, they did so. And in 1789, after almost 2 years, that Constitution became the law of the land. But in that same year of 1789, on July the 14th, 1789, a riot broke out at the Bastille prison in France. The French Revolution began, and before it was all over, hundreds and thousands of people had lost their lives in the greatest eruption of civil violence that Europe had ever seen before. And the question becomes, how did we manage to pull it off here in the United States? To make that kind of transition from autocratic rule from the top down to the rule of the people from the bottom up, and begin to put in place a legal system that protected the civil rights and liberties of all people regardless of their circumstances. Well, one of the things that these people like Madison and Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington and others had discovered was the principle of the mutual interest of all transcends any one individual's personal self-interest. They understood so clearly that a free people could govern themselves from the bottom up if they would keep in mind that the answer is not in bloodshed. The answer is not in violence. The answer is not in hatred and anger at one another and the throwing of names at one another and the perpetration of calumny against one another. The answer is that we work together with one another. And so in October 1789, George Washington, who by then had become the first president of the United States of America, called for the observance of a national day of prayer and thanksgiving scheduled for November the 4th, 1789. Americans agreed on a means whereby they could peacefully govern themselves. I say once again to you who are here this morning and to anyone else who is listening electronically, we as Americans need to be reminded once again that we have a structure that provides for a process by which we can peaceably govern ourselves. We don't need the bullets. We don't need the violence. We don't need the acrimony. We don't need the racial and ethnic hatred. We need to make use of one of the richest blessings that God ever bestowed upon humanity, and that is the capacity to govern ourselves in peace. 2 Thanksgivings. A third one came decades later, when that system of government and that freedom faced its greatest threat. In the midst of the Civil War, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln would wait for a propitious time to issue a proclamation. On July the 4th, 1863, the battles of Gettysburg and of Vicksburg came to an end. In the aftermath of that, it was apparent that while there was much warfare that would continue to take place, ultimately this union of states into a single nation was going to be preserved. And so on October the 3rd, 1863, Lincoln issued a Thanksgiving proclamation. He declared that the last Thursday of November would be a national day of Thanksgiving. And then generations later, on November the 26th, 1941, in another time of extreme national crisis, President Franklin Roosevelt would issue a proclamation that Thanksgiving would be observed on the fourth Thursday of November each year. Principle here is that national interests carry more weight than regional self-interest. That the principles of the dignity and the right of every human being transcends the self-centeredness and the egotism of any one single individual. And it is absolutely important that once again we recognize and declare in this place and everywhere we can that that is a gift of God to us. It is a gift of God that should spread across the planet as we keep in mind that it's not about me personally. It's not about you personally. It's not about our particular groups. It is about all of us, all together, in right relationship with one another, under the leadership of God, with each one of us exercising our personal responsibility in those contexts. And then there's one last Thanksgiving. By this time, that little boy who memorized the 100th Psalm in the 4th grade is living on a farm in West Alabama. And he had played hooky from school that day because he and an uncle needed to cut firewood so that we could keep ourselves warm during the winter. We cut firewood all morning long and hauled load after load to the house. Mid-afternoon, we took a break, and I went in and turned on that old black and white TV set that stood in the corner and dominated the room. And the first thing that I heard was that a gunman shooting from the Texas Textbook Repository building in Dallas, Texas, had assassinated John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the President of the United States. November the 22nd, 1963. The saddest Thanksgiving that this country has ever experienced. And a lot of things were up in the air. I was old enough to hear folks wondering if the rockets were going to start crashing, if the bombs were going to start exploding, if suddenly there was going to be cataclysmic war and destruction. But we made our way through, folks, through a tremendously traumatic set of circumstances and of national anxiety and turmoil. And we came out of it on the other side, affirming that the institutions by which we live, that God has gifted us with, can stand the strain and can stand the stress if we will trust them and be faithful to God and what God has given us. And so as I come to a conclusion this morning, I would ask for us as First Baptist Church of Statesville, North Carolina, and for a larger audience as well, how important are those principles to us? How important is freedom of worship and participatory self-government on November the 25th, 2018? How important is it that we refuse to descend into violence and anarchy the way much of the world wants to go? How important is that we transcend the egotistic self-interest and care more for the good of all in our nation, in our churches, and in our personal families than we do for ourselves or our particular subgroup? How important it is that we continue to make the sacrifices necessary to maintain the struggle against oppression and abuse and terrorism, both at home and abroad. God has given us wealth. God has given us health. God has given us a place in the world. God has given us our homes and our jobs and all of those tangible things. But are we still a people who are willing to risk losing all of those tangible things in order to reaffirm and maintain and rededicate ourselves to those intangible things that are perhaps God's most important gifts to us, just short of the giving of His Son?